Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
That day, for no particular reason, I decided to go for a little run.
Welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast. I'm Brian Auten, and in this episode, we explore the intersection of ethics, endurance, and spiritual formation with ultra-runner, philosopher, and writer Sabrina B. Sabrina is a 5-time U.S. champion in ultra-marathon events, a former member of Team USA, and a researcher and lecturer in philosophy with a focus on virtue ethics and moral formation. She's also a contributing writer for Running Times and I Run Far. Today we're discussing the formative power of endurance sports, how they can cultivate virtue, expose vice, and serve as a training ground not just for the body but for the soul. Chad's not with us today. He's looking at a certain property in downtown New York. I think it's an abandoned firehouse. Anyway, he was going to go to the bank straight after, or something about a third mortgage or something. But at any rate, he's not with us today, but in the following week, I'll be away and he'll be doing an interview. So we're doing a little bit of juggling right now. I hope you'll enjoy this interview. It's a little bit different than normal, but I have an interest in trail running and running around in the mountains and such, and came across Sabrina's book, loved it, and thought, I want to talk to her about character formation and how things like running or endurance sports can really give us some insights into character formation. So I hope you'll enjoy it. Let's go to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Well, Sabrina B. Thanks for joining me for the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So here's my story about finding your book. I've been getting into more and more running and endurance and training and that sort of a thing. And I was looking through various books and I came across your book, which is called The Examined Run: Why Good People Make Better Runners. So I was intrigued by the title, and there's a lot of running books out there. And I thought, well, that sounds sort of philosophical because I'm thinking, the examined life. And I was intrigued. So I downloaded it and I listened to it. I was like, wow, this is great. This is a great hybrid book. I'm totally interested in both these topics. And so all the examples were really great. And it kind of reminded me of, the Apostle Paul talking about running the race. And it just made me realize there's so many analogies here for spiritual development, character developments, virtue development that you see in endurance sports. So thank you for writing that book. Really great. I've gone through it twice now. And so tell me a little bit about yourself and your journey, and how did you get into this ultra running and philosophy and ethics?
Yeah, it's a good question. So starting in high school, I was really interested in Christian apologetics. So that's kind of the on-road that I had into philosophy. I didn't know that there was such a thing called philosophy, but I knew, in some of the humanities classes in my high school, we would read things like Plato's Republic, and we read a little bit of Aristotle, and we would read the Odyssey and things like that, like these great texts. And at the same time at home, I just was really interested in engaging questions of faith. And so I kept finding things like John Lennox's, reflections on science and faith and things like that. So when I went to college, I thought that I was going to be a science person. I signed up for all of these science classes, but it was a liberal arts curriculum. And so I was required to take some philosophy classes. And so in my first philosophy class, I didn't really like it. They were asking a lot of questions, but didn't provide clean answers the way that I was getting in my science classes. But over the course of the semester, I just started to kind of feel at home in a tradition of inquiry. And I was also discovering more like thinkers that I found interesting and compelling, some of which were in the Christian tradition. So Augustine and Aquinas and people like that, church fathers. I also found Plato and Aristotle, who I've spent a lot of time with over the next several years. So I ended up graduating as philosophy and psychology double major. and have continued on that path. So that's how I got into philosophy. Running, honestly, I don't remember life before running. It's something that I've always loved to do. I played a lot of sports growing up: soccer, basketball, volleyball, field hockey. And the through line was that I was always good at the running part. So I started winnowing down my activities when I got to high school and just doing running for its own sake,
Right.
and loved it. Entered college to run and fell into the trail and ultra scene kind of that way.
Well, I'll have to toot your horn when it comes to the philosophy part. Now, from reading the book, I was really impressed by your precision and your thoroughness. It was just like, well, this is scholarly, but this is also talking about training and racing and things like that. And so I could really tell that you're a precise thinker and very clear and able to teach. I very much appreciated that part of it. But if someone goes to your website, which is sabrinalittle.com, they'll see this whole list of like championship things and stuff. So what are some of the longer races you've done, or the ones that maybe you might be proud of?
Yeah, I have been really fortunate to be able to participate in a number of U.S. national teams. So representing the United States in international competition. And anytime I get that chance, those are my favorite moments, because a lot of times the sport is very individual and it's just you out there alone, which is wonderful and a great reflective space. But having US national team opportunities means that you're running with people and it's the shared endeavor, and the experiences are heightened and just so enjoyable because of that. So I guess the high points in my career are that I've won 5 national titles, which generally means you get placed on a national team when that happens, if you perform really well in national championships. So then I've been placed on 5 national teams. I've been a world silver medalist in the 24-hour run, and I set the American record in that event in both the 200K and the 24-hour. Since broken, the level of the sport continues to raise, which is super fun and exciting. More people are running than ever before. So yeah, those are some of my high points.
Yeah. So great stuff. Very impressive. And so now you do some coaching and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Is that
so
right?
I coached for 7 years,
Mm-hmm.
and then in one of the universities that I worked at, I was just a volunteer assistant coach on the NCAA team. At the university right now, I have a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and I'm pregnant with my third. So my coaching commitments are lesser at the moment, but I'm hoping to get back into it eventually.
Yes. Very good. That's really great. So we've talked about your background and stuff, and part of my motivation in doing the interview and having you on was, first off, I love the book. It wasn't like someone sent me the book and, hey, can we be on your podcast or something? But this is one where I like, oh, I have to talk to her because I want to know more. Because I've been reading a bit about development of virtue and the different, the fruits of the spirit and things of that nature. And one thing that struck the chord with me about the topic is this idea that there's certain discipline things that it's like fruit. You can't just have fruit tomorrow. You have to cultivate it. And in order to have things like patience, you can't be patient once and now you're a patient person. It's sort of like there's a time when you just have to keep growing the beard, and then you can say, okay, finally you have the beard because we can see more beard than face now, but there's a point when there's stubble and it's like, you can't say you have that beard, so it's the same thing like virtue formation. But the analog here with sports is that you can't go out there and run 100 miles tomorrow. You'll die. You kill yourself, but one can if they work, they develop, they do these disciplines and they train themselves. So I suppose the idea here is training for righteousness or training the virtues or character development. Can you talk a bit about what is virtue and how you relate that to athletics in its development?
Yeah, it's so many things that I could say. So first of all, in the tradition stemming from Aristotle, the way that virtues are described, like the word is arete, which just means excellence. right? So how do you become a more excellent instance of your kind as a human being, right? And there are going to be some like theologically nested assumptions in here. So first of all, on Aristotle's picture, it's like, how do you acquire them? You acquire them by practice. So he says, men become builders by building and lyre players by playing the lyre. So too, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, right? Because virtues are a kind of habit, he uses the word hexis or active disposition. It's something that's formed by repetition. So you have to do it to be it. And so this takes out the guesswork, right? Because you just repeatedly do the good thing and until it defines you in a stable way. The Christian picture is a little more textured, just insofar as like, what is the great good of a human life for someone like Thomas Aquinas? It would be like beatific vision, right? Knowing and seeing God. And so what's interesting is like, so he describes virtues being formed in two ways. First, you have faith, hope, and love, and they're infused in you. There's nothing you can add to that. Like you are given these things, but then you also have this like natural way of like, you're supposed to participate in your sanctification, right?
Yeah.
It's something that's this ongoing work in you, and it's not passive, right? So you are developing that fruit over time. And one way I like to think about this is like, so there's the athletic kind of like daily working out the goal, right? Daily drawing closer toward that finish line or acting in light of that finish line. But I also think that sports gives us a vision for understanding what this looks like, just insofar as I love running. And so there are a lot of things that I do in ordering my life toward success in my sport. And so if I love God, right, if that is like the central love of my life, there should be certain actions that I'm taking that are reflective of that love, right? Like certain ordering disciplines or way that I'm drawing closer to God on a regular basis. And so it's this thing that's freely given, right? There's like nothing I can add in terms of saving myself. And yet, because I've received this gift of love, there are certain ways in which I draw closer on a daily basis, and I practice being more excellent with that kind of vision in mind.
Yeah. Maybe you could talk about what's the difference between virtue and vice? And is someone virtuous or is someone full of vice? One of the books you referenced in your own book was one by Christian. Oh, what was it called? The Character Gap by Christian. What's his
Miller.
name? Yeah.
Yes.
So I went and read that too.
Nice.
And he was talking about how no one is fully one thing or fully the other, but there's a mixture. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that and how virtue and vice are maybe on a spectrum or something.
Yeah, right. So when the ancients are talking about virtue and vice, it's like to meet the standard of virtue means you consistently act well from the right motivations across situations long term, which is an exceedingly high bar,
Yeah.
right? Like, so thinking about honesty, for example, that would be like, I'm honest to my friends and my family. I'm honest on my taxes. I'm honest, like, in when I'm taking examinations and when I'm talking to myself about my sport and so forth. Like all of these little moments pertain to honesty and having that consistent level of excellence, but also being honest for the right reasons, right? In the right ways and so forth, experiencing fitting emotions toward it, not doing it begrudgingly. So that's an exceedingly high bar. And the same can be said of vices. To consistently choose the wrong thing long term for the wrong reasons, having that kind of consistency is really hard. So realistically, do most of us hit those standards? Probably not. Most of us are probably somewhere in the middle. And what Christian Miller says is that we act consistently enough that reveals that we do have traits with respect to these things. Like, for example, say you are honest to your friends on a regular basis, you'll probably continue to be honest to your friends if you consistently like have high integrity on your taxes, you'll probably continue to have that be the case, but you're not meeting this very high bar or not meeting this very low bar. So you're probably somewhere in the middle with what he calls as mixed traits. And so what that means is you have ample room to grow, ample room to improve your character toward virtue. Most of us have considerable space for progress in our moral lives.
Sort of crossing the streams here between character development and sort of like ethical philosophy through, the academic side of things, like Aristotle and different thinkers and stuff. And then you've got the spiritual side of things where we're talking more theologically, where we're thinking about sanctification, for instance. How do you see those interacting? Because there's an aspect where, for instance, the scripture would say, you are sanctified, but we're also being sanctified. So there's the now, not yet aspect of that. I wonder maybe if you could unpack your thoughts on that, on how, because as you say, there's a huge high bar. And of course, as Christians, we know we can't make that standard, but we're still striving for it. But we're not striving in order to attain salvation. We're already saved. However, we are still striving for sanctification, and we're working and God is working. So how do you, as you've thought through these things, how do you see those two interacting?
Yeah, it's a complex question, right? Like in both cases, I have work to do, but in the Christian case, it's like, I'm not the only one doing work and I'm not the initiator of this work, right? He's begun this good work in me and is seeing it through to completion. And I am just like doing my best, toddling through, trying to contribute constructively to that work or participate in that work. So like, I don't know, when I'm thinking of from like the Aristotelian type approach, it's like, I'm waking up and have an agenda and, trying to work through my own excellences and trying to, like become a more excellent instance of my kind as a human. When I'm waking up from the Christian perspective, like that perspective is I am participating in the rhythm of God's grace, and it is work that has already begun in me, right? And so I am not like the author of that work. And so that's like it's a different approach. It's also a different finish line, right? Like on the Aristotelian picture, it's like I'm going to try to get myself to become as good as I can on my own terms through my own faculties and the limits of my own imagination. And on the Christian picture, it's like there's a person and I'm trying to draw closer to that person. Yeah. And then, right, like in both cases, I think both pictures kind of offer you honesty in terms of like what you are, like your defects, right? But in one case, like in the natural case, it's like that's on me. And in the other case, I'm kind of disemburdened from seeing it as fully like when I mess up, it's like, okay, well, Christ already did this thing, right? And it's kind of funny, like I think is it Kierkegaard who makes some comment about how no one is free to laugh quite like the saint is, because the saint is disemburdened from having to save himself. Like he can see his incongruities, he can see the ways in which he falls short, and also he knows that he is going to fall short and there's this other person there. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely like a switching of perspectives, primarily in terms of where you're going, but also your authorship in becoming more excellent.
Yeah. Now I want to ask about what role do you think maybe habit and discipline play in forming virtue, and maybe as it relates to sports?
Yeah, I mean, sports is really a great laboratory for virtue, I think, just because you show up every day with the intention of improving, right? And you do it out of like this kind of love, right? Like if I love the sport, be it soccer, be it running, be it something else, I want to show up and I want to improve, right? And that kind of like intentional repetition is a really good framework for working on virtues that are acquired by repetition. So I think like not having a practice space like this, and honestly, does it have to be sport? No, like you could be really into gardening or music or something else. Sports is just like my own space. And so it's a space that I know really well. But if you have this kind of practice space where you can show up every day and intentionally work on things, and that's not just like the physical practice, but also the habits of mind, learning to deal with kind of outsized emotions, practicing being diligent, practicing like failing, coming up against other people's excellences and learning how to navigate like how to deal with that in a way that has dignity. That is really valuable in terms of doing the work of being formed. Whereas if I didn't have that space, well, sometimes there could be occasions to work on courage in my life, but they're not going to be a regular thing, or patience. Like there's not going to be this systematic and regular coming up against needing to wait in the way that you get in sports. And so I think it's this really unique space that we have to practice virtue. I also think there's a kind of, when you are working on virtues in normal life, I think sometimes the risks and stakes are higher. Like, for example, say you're working on courage in a workout. Well, if you fail during the workout, what is that going to look like? Maybe you blow up, right? Because you go too quickly and you assume too much risk and experience not enough fear. And that's a problem. But if you do it, like, say you send a really firmly worded email to a boss, who you've been too mousy around and you assume too much risk, well, that could cost you your job, right? So having this kind of like practice space to work on your character, I think is a really neat opportunity for the repetition, but also because the stakes are a lot lower if you mess up.
Yeah, it's in a way, it's there are virtues that you seem to gain that I'm trying to think of the term that they're transferable skills sort of thing, where, for instance, I would think that I'm more resilient, more determined, more focused because of training that I've done. I think that transfers to other areas of my life. I kind of think that there are certain traits that through doing the physical training, I think that it's true that one becomes a different type of person in a good way. And it also becomes, I kind of have this idea that every race is a microcosm of life. And the longer the race, the more it is a picture of like life. Because it's like you can go through every single emotion and you can have ups and downs and there's high points and low points. And there's sort of this learning aspect to it where, okay, I just learned life lessons and I was just running. I wonder if maybe you've had those experiences and maybe you could give us some examples and elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a life in a day kind of experience in some of these races, because in races, your emotions are heightened, first of all. And so sometimes you're dealing with the ugliness of yourself in a compressed space. Like you get frustrated and you just have to sit there with your frustration. Or I mean, you promised yourself that you'll get to the finish and you really want to quit, right? And so there's this irresolution in yourself and you have to overcome and show yourself kind of one step at a time that you can see the task through to completion. And so I think that's definitely the case. And in terms of like the resilience that you talked about, right? So resilience, what is that? It's kind of like maintaining effective agency in the face of setbacks, right? Continuing to choose and act in light of the possibility of renewal, even when there's minimal evidence that you can finish or something like that. I mean, there is empirical evidence that during play, this is formed. In fact, one of the worries, so there's this book by Jonathan Haidt where he talks about the anxious generation, how our children are being undone by screens. And one of the literatures he engages is the impact of play on forging resilience that is lost if you just have a screen-based childhood, right?
Mm.
And I've really seen this like play out in my own running, right? Because I've been able to push through when I don't think it's possible. And also, even when I fail and have been soundly defeated in races and it's my fault and all these things, I have to show up the next day and keep training. And so learning to show up even when you've failed is really a valuable life skill that can transfer over.
Yeah, and it seems like another thing would be like you're training not in just like there's an ultimate telos, a goal that you're trying to achieve. Let's say, and I'm thinking of how a race equates to the Christian life, for instance, and the training aspect of it, where you're running the race, but you're running the race and you happen to be training at the same time. But you're thinking about not just today, but how is this going to prepare me for tomorrow and the next day? And then what am I going to do to build upon that and that? So there's an aspect of foresight and sort of a long-term view. And I think that's really helpful because as Christians, we have to have that long-term view and we have to build upon the virtues and acknowledge, like, honestly acknowledge our lacks and say, well, how am I actually going to change these things and work on them over time, you know?
Yeah, right. And I think, right. So in scripture, there's the passage on the race for faith. I think one way in which we consistently move forward through those periods of recognition of frailties, like that whole section is laced with like the context of there are other saints who've done this and you're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's so emboldening. Like anytime that I've had a workout that is really challenging, having a friend there who's also running, it gets so much more out of you, right? Because it's rare that you feel bad at the same time, or even just knowing that other people have done the same route and they've gotten it done. It's like something that is so encouraging. And so I resonate with that part of that passage where it's like, these are all these great heroes of faith, and now they are the audience, right? And they've been there before. It kind of like, yeah, it shows you it can be done. And when you feel weak, you kind of draw on the vision that they've set out for you and show you that it's possible.
No, so I've been thinking about how in athletics or running or any sort of sport someone's in, there is a certain effect that someone wants from its training stimulus. So they know that this sort of workout is going to give them this sort of effect. And that's great because once you sort of learn yourself and learn the effects, you can kind of plan your outcome within a certain, targets, within certain expectations, and you can kind of work on yourself based upon how you're responding to that. So when we're talking about like those are so like physical disciplines, right? But when we're talking about spiritual formation and spiritual disciplines, I see the principle there from the athletics. And I see how there are certain things that one does if they are doing training, that there is something transferable. I'm just wondering, when it comes to character formation and spiritual development, is the workout, if you will, spiritual disciplines? Is it my prayer life? Is it reading scripture? Is it fellowship? Is it all of those things? Would that sort of be the analog or the sort of thing that, okay, engage in these things and you will bear fruit. This will cause certain changes in your character and things like that. What would you say to that idea?
I think so. I don't think that athletics should ever be thought of as a standalone tool for the formation of your character,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, like Christian context aside, like what are things that are often relied on as ways of growing in character? I mean, one is reading great books. Another is exposure to excellent people who are going to give you a vision of what a good life is. Another is praise and blame, right? Like when you have a child, for example, and you say, like, you're doing a great job. Thank you so much for sharing. That is something that calls them to that standard, or the converse, right? So you were not so nice to your sibling, right? Another thing is like guilt or shame, like these kind of negative balance emotions that we try to avoid culturally, but are super valuable in our lives in terms of calling us, to something different, to be more excellent. And then in the Christian context, yeah, it's like everything you named, right? So revelation, right? Spending time reading scripture. It's spending time in a community of believers. It's like having that sort of quiet, reflective time, those moments of contrition. But then it's also like physical practices. And I think one really great source for reflecting on the nature, the kinds of physical practices that could benefit a Christian life would come from the desert fathers. So these were monks who were living in the desert in the medieval time period, and they had all of these physical practices and would do things that maybe to us seem like honestly strange, right? Like sometimes they were anchorites and they would wander alone in the desert, or sometimes they would be stylites and they would stand on these poles, right? Sometimes they would do these practices of temperance where they would, like, I remember reading that one monk, he would hang like cucumbers in his little scriptorium area. And it was like to try to desensitize him from, he felt that he had an outsized appetite and wanted to glorify God in that way. And another way was this practice called stabilitas loci. And in stabilitas loci, you would do your manual labor, but they were noticing that they had this thing that they called the noon demon or something. Like they would become frenetically internally busy, and they wanted to practice being able to stay in place on a task and do that meaningful work and not resist the demands of love placed on them. And so all that they were doing in that task was just remaining in their physical work and having their attention fully fixed on that practice. And I see that one as particularly applicable as a distance runner, because sometimes one of the temptations that I have is to try to, without a vision of what I would do instead, I just want to stop and do something else, right? Like you feel distracted and it's hard to stay there, to stay where you are and do the work that's set before you. And instead, you want to do literally anything else and you have no vision of what you want to do instead. And that kind of like stabilitas loci practice that you get in the context of distance running, where you just remain on task, I think is really, really valuable, spiritually speaking.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm reminded of a new word I learned when I was reading your book, and it was intransigence. I thought that was really fascinating. Maybe you could unpack that and give me some examples of what that might be and how common that might be for people in this sort of sport.
Yeah. So intransigence is just an excess with respect to remaining in place. And so when you think about perseverance, it's positioned between a vice of deficiency, which is irresolution. So you can't commit to things and you are like a way of, the work that you're supposed to do, but you can't get yourself to commit to it, right? This kind of irresolution. But the excess, right, is intransigence, or bullheadedness or pertinacity, whatever word you want to use to describe
Yeah,
it.
these are great. They're great words. They're so descriptive. And I didn't know there were, just to interrupt 2 seconds, having words for these virtues and vices, that is like the first step to developing these things, because you're, oh, yeah, I see that character trait. I didn't realize it. That's a thing. And it's really helpful.
Yeah, it's kind of like as a child when you acquire a grammar in different disciplines and you can see the world in new ways that you weren't aware of before. Like I
Mm-hmm.
feel the same thing, morally speaking, when I learn about virtues and vices. Like it gives me spectacles to better see myself and
Yeah.
others. But this kind of intransigence hides in plain sight in distance running, because sometimes we hold on imprudently, we hold on past when we should. And so an example is, I just read, there's this book, Into Thin Air, and it's about the Everest climbers.
Mm.
And so much of what makes those people successful is that they are committed, stubbornly committed, right? And sometimes it's successful, and then other times it's their undoing. And so many people
Mm.
lose their lives because they just push past the point when it ceases to make sense. And we can do this in distance running by sometimes holding on too long past injury, right? Or overstepping kind of lines in our lives that are not even physical. Like sometimes they are cultural, right? So stepping on family time in order to get a run in, or committing to complete a race, even when doing so means that you are treading on other responsibilities in your life, like your work or your family or friends who need you or something like that. And so the point is just that not all finish lines are good ones, right? So you might make it to the finish line, and also it could be something that detracts from a good life because that's not like a finish line that was suitable. So perseverance is a good when it's fixed on good ends and is performed in suitable ways, but we can definitely experience an excess with respect to that virtue.
Yeah. It was funny because sort of in tandem, if not prior to reading your book, I also read some other famous runners, like biography and some of their adventures. And it was like I was seeing everything you were saying, as far as the vices and things like that. And I know, well, I wouldn't say that person's name, but another one person I would say is like, I think a lot of people know about ultra running, not from people who are actually doing it for the sport itself, but maybe hearing of it from like David Goggins or something. And so they associate that with that sort of go all in, sort of hardcore, insane approach. And, we were talking about certain vices, or what was it, performance enhancing vices and things like that. Some of those stories I've read there kind of remind me of that, because it's like, you're really persevering here, but you're crazy. I don't know how to put it other than that,
Yeah, I think, well, yeah. So a couple things about that. Like one, I think, because those kinds of voices really bother me too, right? But I think that in some cases it's a correction for the fact that a lot of the people who are receiving those messages are more on the irresolution side, and they need to be, pushed in the opposite direction a little bit to persist. But when I hear things like that, I mean, yeah, like it's sort of suffering that is irrespective of like the kind of suffering that you're going to undergo, and whether the pains that you're experiencing are actually just imprudence. Sometimes it means like pushing past signs in your body that say you should quit, right? But I mean, a lot of the influencer culture and a lot of fitness culture rests on these sort of slogans. And, like it fits less neatly on a t-shirt if you say things like never quit, except when you definitely should, because you're overstepping boundaries in your life that you should respect. And all these like little asterisks and caveats about when it's actually a good idea to suffer, what are proper limits on that sort of thing.
Yeah. You know how vices and virtues are so often excesses or deficiencies of something that you should have. And I don't think because I don't think about ethics as a subject, and so I don't study it too deeply. It's not my thing, like area of expertise or something. But I was just reminded that it's so important that a lot of these things we start out might be good. So there were certain aspects in your book there that was like convicting in a way, because I was like doing some introspection and thinking, okay, what lines do I need to draw to make sure that this is a healthy thing and not something that either leads to other people resenting it or me burning out or things like that. And I think that's got to be a struggle for a whole bunch of people, because when it comes to certain sports, certain personality types seem to gravitate towards them, and then certain vices emerge that are just so common to that particular sport or whatever.
Yeah. And I wish there were a very firm line and you could say, this is when you cross over from perseverance to pertinacity, right?
Yeah.
But it's so dependent on your context and how something is fitting within your life. Like when I speak to young runners, the one thing I always tell them to do is to have people speaking into your life who are outside of the sport, because sometimes I think things that are praised within the sport actually aren't praiseworthy, and you might lack vision within the sport, right? It's someone saying, "Oh, you're so dedicated and, great job persevering," but someone who loves you and wills your good and is outside of the sport might see that you're crossing a line before you see it. And so having people you admire both within the sport but also outside of the sport to give you that kind of competing vision is really valuable. And I always ask my husband that. I'm like, should I I'm intending to do the second run. Like, is that a good idea? Is there something else I should be doing right now? Just to keep the dialogue open, because sometimes I can't even see that I've crossed a line, or I only see it in retrospect. And having someone who can speak clearly into your life and that they love you, like that's a really valuable thing to have.
I wonder if you could speak to what your thoughts are on competitiveness. And I'm not a big like Strava person or something like that, but I have a little Garmin groups and things, and I feel like I'm overly competitive. And although I don't go around shouting, "Hey, I win" and stuff like that, I still, I'm like, do I need to disconnect from that? Because I just, as soon as I'm not in first place or something, I'm like, I have to change that. And I just don't know if that's a vice or if just is, I don't know how to tell if this is bad or not,
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think our cultural imagination for what competition is so entangled in envy, right? This kind of vice of unhappy self assertion that we have a limited imagination for what it might look like in good ways, right? And I always like to tell people, like, striving is not a problem, right? Competing is just striving together, right? And if virtue means excellence, right? Trying to become more excellent is going to involve a fair amount of striving, right? And how do we often get a vision of what excellence is? Through other people, right? So striving with other people can be super valuable. Even certain negative emotions that we experience in the context of other people's excellence can be really fruitful and action guiding. And one example is this kind of emulation. So you experience this sort of negative feeling toward yourself when you realize that you lack some good thing, coupled with this kind of positive feeling toward that good thing. And so it's this mixed balanced emotion where you feel like, oh, I like have this lack and I see this beautiful thing that I want. And emulation is a kind of leveling up emotion. And we see that in scripture too. It's like outdo one another in good deeds, right? It's this kind of raising up, like seeing the good in the other and then calling yourself to a higher standard. We see it in like virtue friendships too. Another alternative is admiration, right? So having this sort of appreciative perception of the good in another person. And so there are these alternative emotions for experiencing the excellence of another person that don't have to be envious.
Right,
right?
right, yeah.
And so like experiencing gratitude for the other person or something like that. But yeah, like I sometimes when I'm talking to young teams or something like that, they assume that in occupying competition in a virtuous way, that means they need to be kind of mousy toward competition or not say that they're striving for something or kind of like hide those things away and that there's no winsome way of striving. And I don't think that's true at all. Like I think there's this virtue called magnanimity that Aquinas talks about. And it's this kind of well-ordered striving. You consider yourself worthy of great things that you are indeed worthy of. And yet it's humble enough to recognize that you're not self-caused, that a lot of good in you is gifted, and you rely on other people. And so if you can strike that balance, then that's the goal. It's not like a failure to strive at all. It is like trying to be more excellent and trying to get there and relying on other people. So I don't know, like personally, am I there? Like I've, dealt with envy in my own racing a lot. Like I think that's just, but being honest about the category and trying to occupy the other vision and trying to encourage younger athletes to like practice being able to celebrate the excellence of other people, because there's a kind of undoing of the competition itself when you can't celebrate other people.
Mm.
And I honestly think of it as being like a kind of theft, because if you can only celebrate when you win, but then you're going to explain away the successes of other people or not let them have their moment, then like you're taking something away from someone else. And I don't think that's a good way of occupying sport.
Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about our listeners, and maybe if they're sticking with us, and maybe they happen to be a non-athlete. How do you think they can begin to think about character development for, even though they might not be into sports or athletics or things like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Honestly, like I talk to my students a lot about these sorts of things. Like sometimes they assume that their character is a given. So, for example, they have a hard time reading, for example, and they just say, I just have a short attention span. It's just who I am. Right. And the one thing that I want to impress upon them is just that they do have agency with respect to their character. They can improve in a number of these respects, but it's not something that's going to happen by accident, right? It has to have this kind of intentional character of improvement. And sports gives us a really good model for it, but like music does as well, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't expect on day one to be able to play some sort of beautiful concerto. So just have this kind of long view of where they want to go,
Mm-hmm.
surround themselves by people that they look up to and that can remind them of a sort of vision of what they'd like to be, but then taking that first step of improvement and continue to work toward the kind of character that they'd like to have.
Now, I do want to point our listeners to your book, and again, that one is called The Examined Run: Why Good People Make Better Runners. But I wonder what particular thinkers, Sabrina, have influenced you a lot, or said, hey, here's a handful of books that here's something that should be on your shelf. This has been influential to me.
So I always turn people to the Confessions, Augustine's Confessions, as like my greatest recommendation from the history of philosophy. Just it's kind of like a reflective practice on himself and his own sin and his drawing closer to God. Like that's going to be the number one recommendation always. But in terms of contemporary philosophers, I mean, you named one of them. So Christian Miller, his Character Gap is a great book. He's in the process of writing a book on honesty right now that's intended for public audience, and that's going to be so good. I know it's going to be
that previous
very good.
book of his, wasn't that something like in tandem with the Templeton Foundation?
Yeah, so Templeton funded a lot of, he had a massive character grant, and now he has a massive honesty one.
Cool. Yeah, that'll be interesting.
Yeah, he's already written like an academic monograph on honesty, but is coming out with a public facing one now. So that, and then there's a great book by Nathan King called An Excellent Mind, and that's on intellectual virtues, and that one is really accessible as well, and I highly recommend it.
Cool. Well, that's great. Now, if people want to find your work, I mentioned earlier your website, sabrinalittle.com.
Yeah, I do a lot of public writing on irunfar.com. So there's a column there called The Examined Run. And I put out pieces monthly there. And then I also write for Psychology Today in a blog called Considerations of Character. And I'm on a number of social media channels, mostly to share those articles as they come out.
Well, Sabrina, it's just been a great pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for a great book, and I'm very much inspired by it. It's already led me to other books and things, and I'm sure that I'm going to continue looking at this subject. So thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me, and that means a lot. Thank you for that feedback.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.